Story 1, The Reflection. Shawnee National Forest, Illinois. The campsite was perfect. This was what Diane kept saying on the drive in and again when they pulled into the site and again, while they set up the tent, that it was perfect. And she was right in the way that some campsites are right. The specific configuration of flat ground and tree cover and proximity to water that makes a site feel chosen rather than assigned. The Shawnee National Forest in southern Illinois had been her suggestion, her research, her reservation, and her husband Paul's willingness to go along with it was the kind of marital generosity that she had accepted graciously and intended to validate through the quality of the trip. They arrived on a Friday afternoon in late September. Paul and Diane Whitfield, married 11 years, both 41, with the easy camping competence of people who had been doing it together long enough to have a system. They set up the tent in 12 minutes. The fire was going by 6. They made dinner in the dark, the way people make dinner in the dark when the dark is familiar, and the fire is warm, and the rest of the world has been successfully left behind on a Friday afternoon on a county road 3 hours south of Chicago. They had a lake, not a large one of the small glacial lakes that existed throughout the Shawnee, accessed by a short path through the tree line behind the campsite. Paul had found it on the satellite view of the map when planning the site selection, and had pointed it out to Diane, and Diane had agreed that a private lake was what elevated a good campsite to a perfect one. They went to it after dinner, the two of them with headlamps, and they sat on the bank and watched the water and listened to the specific silence of a body of water in a forest at night, which is a silence that is full rather than empty, textured with the sounds of things living in and around the water that have no concern for the people sitting on the bank. They went to bed at 10, slept well, woke at 7 to a morning that was exactly what the forecast had promised, cool and clear with the light coming through the trees at the angle that makes forests look like they were designed rather than grown. The second night is where it started. They had spent the day hiking a trail that ran along the forest's ridge system, 8 miles of good terrain with views of the Ohio River Valley that Diane photographed extensively, and Paul appreciated without photographing because he processed things internally rather than through documentation, and this was one of the ways they were different and compatible simultaneously. They came back to the camp tired in the satisfying way of physical tiredness, made food, built the fire higher than the night before, and at 9:30 Diane said she wanted to go to the lake. Paul said it was dark. Diane said they had headlamps. The lake at night was different from the lake at dusk. This was not a surprise. It was smaller somehow, or felt smaller, the tree line around it closer and darker, the water black rather than the deep blue it had been the previous evening. They sat on the bank, and Diane turned her headlamp off because she wanted to see the stars reflected in the water, and Paul left his on because he was reading the water temperature of the situation, and the temperature suggested keeping a light on was the correct call. With Diane's headlamp off and Paul's on, aimed at the ground rather than the water, the lake was illuminated from one side by the ambient glow of Paul's lamp, and from above by the stars and their reflection, and it was genuinely beautiful in the way that black water in a forest at night is beautiful when you are with someone you trust, and the beauty is stronger than the unease. Diane was looking at the star reflections in the water when she said, "There's someone on the other side." Paul looked up from his book. He looked across the lake, which was narrow enough that the other bank was visible, maybe 60 yards of water between the two banks. The other bank was dark, tree line beginning immediately at the water's edge. He looked, and he did not see anyone. Diane said, "There, just to the left of that bent tree." Paul looked at the bent tree, which was a distinctive silhouette against the slightly less dark of the sky, and to the left of it he saw what Diane was describing. A shape at the water's edge on the opposite bank, upright, still, the shape of a person standing at the water's edge looking across the lake. Paul turned his headlamp toward the opposite bank. The beam reached 60 yards and illuminated the opposite bank at a strength that resolved shapes into details. Tree trunks, undergrowth, the bent tree, And to the left of the bent tree, where the shape had been, nothing. Paul said, "I don't see anyone." Diane said, "They moved when you turned the light." Paul kept the beam on the opposite bank for a full minute. The bank was empty. Undergrowth and tree trunks and the bent tree and 60 yards of black water between them and it, and nothing moving on the other side. They went back to the camp. They did not discuss it much. Paul filed it as a shape that Diane had read as a person in the way that human brains read upright shapes in the dark as people because human brains are calibrated to find people in the dark. Diane filed it as something she had seen, and that had moved when the light turned toward it, and which she did not have an explanation for. She lay in the tent that night and she listened to the forest, and she thought about the shape and about the specific quality of it, the uprightness and the stillness, and she thought about the way it had been at the water's edge in the position of someone standing at the edge of a lake and looking across it. Looking at them. She fell asleep. She woke at 2:14. She did not know why she woke. She lay in the tent and she listened, and the forest was making its sounds, the sounds of a forest in the deep middle of the night, and nothing was wrong with any of them. Then she heard the sound at the lake. Not a splash, not the sound of an animal drinking or a fish breaking the surface. A different sound. The sound of something moving through water deliberately, the specific sound of displacement that a body moving through water at a lake's edge makes, a rhythmic sound that had a pace and a direction. It was moving along the edge of the lake. From the far bank, the bank where the shape had been, along the lake's perimeter, toward the path that led to the campsite. Diane put her hand on Paul's arm and she gripped it and he woke. She did not speak. She pointed in the direction of the lake sound, and Paul listened, and his body did what bodies do when they hear something wrong, which was go completely still with the stillness of something deciding between fight and flight. The sound moved along the bank. It came to the path. It came up the path. It stopped at the edge of the campsite. Diane and Paul lay in the tent, and they did not breathe with any volume, and they listened. They could hear something at the edge of the campsite. Not moving, just present. The specific sound of presence, of something breathing and existing in a space, outside their tent, at the edge of the firelight which had burned down to embers. Paul unzipped the tent. He did it in one motion, fast, the way you do something fast when the alternative is doing it slowly. He came out of the tent with his headlamp on, and he stood up, and he turned the beam to the edge of the campsite. The edge of the campsite was empty. Tree line, undergrowth, the dark of the forest beyond, nothing at the edge, nothing between the tent and the tree line. Paul swept the beam in a full circle around the campsite. Empty. He walked to the path to the lake and he shone the beam down it. Empty path, the lake visible at the end of it, dark and still. He came back to the tent. Diane was sitting up in the sleeping bag with the tent door open. She looked at him. He said, "Nothing." She said, "I heard it come up the path." He said, "I know." They sat in the tent with the door open and Paul's headlamp on until 4 a.m. Nothing came back. The forest made its sounds, and nothing was wrong with any of them, and at 4 the eastern sky began to show the first suggestion of gray, and they packed the tent. They were on the road by 5:30, 3 hours before they had planned to leave. Paul drove and Diane sat in the passenger seat, and after 40 minutes of driving in silence, she asked him if he thought she had imagined it. He said, "I heard it come up the path." She said, "The shape across the lake." He said, "I saw it too, before I turned the light." She looked at him. He had not told her this. He had said he didn't see it. He said, "I didn't want to stay there any longer than we needed to." She said, "What did it look like?" He said, "Like someone standing at the water's edge watching us." She said, "What do you think it was?" He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "I think it was someone. I think it was a person." She thought about that for the rest of the drive home. About the shape across the lake and the sound along the bank, and the presence at the edge of the campsite, and the specific question of why a person would stand across a lake in the dark at 9:30 at night watching a couple at a fire, and then move along the bank at 2 in the morning and come up the path and stand at the edge of the campsite and be gone before a headlamp turned. She thought about that question for a long time. She still thinks about it. She has not found an answer that she is comfortable with. Story 2, Site 14. Sam Houston National Forest, Texas. The rule about Site 14 was not in the campground's official materials. It was not on the reservation website or the ranger station handout or the laminated site map at the campground entrance. It was passed between campers the way certain information passes in certain communities, not through official channels, but through the lateral transmission of people who have been somewhere and want to make sure the person going there knows, something they will not find on the website. The rule was this: do not take Site 14. Caleb Marsh did not know the rule. He was 23 years old, and he was from Houston, and he had booked Site 14 at the Double Lake Recreation Area in the Sam Houston National Forest because it was available and had good reviews and was close to the lake. And he had driven the hour and a half from Houston on a Thursday afternoon in August with his girlfriend Renata and their friend group of 4, 6 people and 2 tents, and the specific ambitious energy of a group of 20-somethings planning their first serious camping trip. They arrived at 4 in the afternoon. Site 14 was exactly what the reviews described: a large site with mature pine trees and good shade, and a cleared area for the tents and a fire ring and a picnic table, and a view through the trees toward the lake. They set up efficiently with the efficiency of people who are excited about something and let the excitement do the work. By 6, they had 2 tents up, and the food organized and the cooler packed, and someone had found a Bluetooth speaker. And the site had the chaotic, warm energy of 6 people beginning a weekend they had been planning for a month. The couple in Site 13, immediately adjacent, were an older pair who had been there since the previous day, and who observed the arrival of 6 20-somethings with a Bluetooth speaker, with the specific patience of experienced campers who have made peace with the fact that campgrounds are shared spaces. The man's name was Walt, and he came over at 6:30 and introduced himself and made the kind of conversation that neighboring campers make. "Where are you from? How long are you staying? Have you been to Sam Houston before?" He was pleasant and easy, and Caleb liked him. As Walt was leaving, he turned back and said, almost as an afterthought, that Caleb should know the trail at the south end of Site 14, the one that went into the trees, was not a maintained trail, and he would recommend not using it after dark. Caleb asked why. Walt said the campground had a history, and the South Trail was part of that history, and people who used the South Trail after dark tended to have unpleasant experiences. Caleb asked what kind of history. Walt said he would rather not go into detail, but that the recommendation stood, and he said goodnight and went back to Site 13. Caleb told the group about the conversation. The group received it with the specific attitude of 23-year-olds who have been told by a stranger not to do something, which was a mixture of curiosity and the inclination to disregard. Renata said they should listen to the man. 2 of the others agreed with Renata. The remaining 2 said a trail was a trail, and old campers always had stories about every forest, and the stories were always more interesting than the reality. They did not go on the South Trail that night. The South Trail came to them. They went to bed at midnight. The fire had burned down and the Bluetooth speaker had been silenced in consideration of neighboring sites, and the 6 of them had distributed between the 2 tents, and the campsite was quiet in the way. Campgrounds go quiet after midnight when the families are asleep and the fires are embers. Caleb woke at 3-something. Not 3 exactly, somewhere in the 3 o'clock hour. He lay in the tent and he listened. The tent held 3 people, himself and Renata and their friend Jake, and both of them were breathing in the even rhythms of sleep, and the campsite was quiet and the forest beyond was making its sounds. But something was wrong with the sounds. He was not an experienced camper. He had not camped enough to have the fluency of someone who knows what a forest sounds like at 3 in the morning and knows what is and is not part of that sound. But he was 23 years old with functioning instincts, and the instincts were telling him something was wrong with what he was hearing. The sound that was wrong was coming from the south end of the site, from the direction of the South Trail. It was a sound that he could not immediately name, and that took him several minutes of lying still and listening to categorize, and the category he eventually placed it in was this. It was the sound of something moving through the undergrowth at the edge of the site, moving with a rhythm that was not the rhythm of an animal, not the erratic movement of something foraging or fleeing, but the specific rhythm of something that was packing. Back and forth, along the south edge of the site, the length of the campsite from one side to the other, moving at a consistent pace, turning, coming back, packing. Caleb unzipped his sleeping bag, and he put on his shoes, and he unzipped the tent door, slowly, trying not to wake the others. He came out into the campsite. The campsite was dark, the fire dead, the only light the ambient light of a clear August night through the pine canopy above. He stood in the campsite and he listened. The packing sound was at the south edge. He could hear it clearly now that he was outside the tent, the movement through the undergrowth, steady and rhythmic, back and forth. He turned on his phone flashlight and pointed it at the south edge of the campsite. The undergrowth at the south edge of Site 14, where the maintained campsite met the beginning of the South Trail, was dense pine undergrowth, the kind of low growth that fills the space between mature pine trunks in a Texas national forest. In the beam of his phone flashlight, he could see the pine trunks and the undergrowth and the beginning of the South Trail's path cutting through it. He could not see what was making the sound. The sound continued, back and forth. He watched the undergrowth and the sound moved through it, and the undergrowth did not move with it. No branch displaced, no leaf shifted, no visible disturbance in the growth at the south edge as the sound moved through it. Caleb stood in the campsite for 3 minutes with his phone flashlight on the south edge and listened to the packing sound move through growth that did not respond to it. And then he went to Site 13 and he knocked on Walt's tent. Walt came out. He was awake in the way of experienced campers who sleep lightly in campgrounds and do not require much transition from sleep to fully functional. Caleb did not have to say much. Walt heard the sound from where he was standing at the entrance to his own tent, and he listened to it for a moment, and then he went back in his tent, and he came out with a larger flashlight, a proper camping lamp, and he walked to the south edge of Site 14, and he stood there, and he shone the lamp into the undergrowth. The sound stopped. Walt stood with the lamp on the south edge for a long time. Nothing. The packing sound was gone. The undergrowth was still. The South Trail was an empty path into the dark forest. Walt turned to Caleb. He said, "How long?" Caleb said he didn't know. He'd woken up to it. Walt said, "Pack up in the morning and move to a different site. Tell the ranger station what you heard." Caleb asked him what it was. Walt said, "I don't know what it is. I know that Site 14 has had this reported more times than any other site in this campground, and that the ranger station has never identified a cause, and that the people who stay more than one night in Site 14, after hearing this, consistently report it getting closer." Caleb said, "Closer to the tents." Walt said, "Each night, yes." Caleb looked at the south edge of the campsite in Walt's lamp beam, the still undergrowth, the empty South Trail. In the morning, he told the others what had happened. They moved to Site 7. He reported it to the ranger station. The ranger he spoke to listened without surprise and made notes with the specific efficiency of someone adding to a file rather than starting one. Caleb asked the ranger how many reports there were. The ranger said, "Enough." Caleb asked what the ranger's explanation was. The ranger said, "We don't have one." He said this in the flat, honest voice of someone who has looked for an explanation and has not found one and has reached the point of accepting that the not finding is the finding. Site 14 is still available for reservation in the Sam Houston National Forest. It has good reviews. It is close to the lake. It has mature pine trees and good shade and a cleared area for tents and a fire ring and a picnic table. And a south trail that nobody who has spent more than one night in Site 14 will use after dark. Story 3, The Other Tent. Gifford-Pinchot National Forest, Washington. There were only supposed to be 2 tents. This was the detail that Alina Vasquez came back to afterward, again and again, in the weeks of processing that followed the camping trip to the Gifford-Pinchot National Forest in the Cascade Range of Washington state. 2 tents. She and her college roommate Bex had driven up from Portland on a Saturday morning, and they had packed 2 tents and set up 2 tents and crawled into their respective tents at 10 that night, and that was all that should have been in the campsite. The 3rd tent was there in the morning. She saw it when she unzipped her tent at 7:15 to the specific gray and damp Pacific Northwest morning that the Cascades produce in September, the fog in the trees and the light diffuse, and the camp still smelling of the previous night's fire. She came out of her tent, and she stood up and she looked at the campsite, and the 3rd tent was there, at the far edge of the site, under a Douglas fir that she was certain she had looked at the previous evening, and that had not had a tent under it. It was a dome tent, the standard 2-person backpacking dome that is sold by every outdoor retailer and comes in approximately 6 colors, of which this one was dark green, the color that disappears into a forest background most effectively. It was set up correctly, staked and tensioned, the rain fly on. It had been set up by someone who knew how to set up a tent. Alina looked at the tent, and she looked at the rest of the campsite, and she looked at the tent again. She went to Bex's tent, and she unzipped it, and she said, quietly, Bex's name. Bex came awake, and Alina said, "There's a 3rd tent." Bex came out of her tent, and they both stood in the campsite, and they looked at the dark green dome at the far edge under the Douglas fir. Neither of them spoke for a moment. Then Bex said, "Someone set up in our site in the night." This was the most reasonable explanation, and they held it. Campgrounds were sometimes misnavigated. Backpackers sometimes came in late and set up in an available-looking space without checking the site markers. The tent had been set up in the darkest corner of the site, the corner with the densest tree cover, which was consistent with someone who had arrived late and was trying to minimize disruption. Alina said, "We should see if they're awake." Beck said, "Maybe give them a few minutes." They made coffee. They sat at the picnic table and they drank it and they watched the dark green tent. Nothing moved in it. No sound from it, no rustling of sleeping bags or zippers. At 8 o'clock, Alina walked to the tent and she crouched in front of the door and she said, loudly enough to wake someone sleeping, that she wanted to check if they were okay and that this was a reserved site. No response from inside the tent. She said it again. Nothing. She looked at the tent door. The zipper was closed. She put her hand on the tent's rain fly and she pressed gently. The tent had the resistance of an empty tent, not the resistance of a tent with weight and mass inside it, the resistance of a structure with nothing in it. She unzipped the tent door. Empty, the tent had no sleeping bag, no pack, no gear of any kind. It was a bare tent, set up correctly and completely with nothing inside it. The interior smelled of the outdoors and nothing else. There was no impression in the tent floor from a sleeping pad or a body. The tent was simply there, empty, set up in the dark corner of their campsite overnight. Alina and Bex looked at the empty tent, and then at each other and then at the campsite around them. The other campsites in this section of the Gifford-Pinchot were dispersed, the next one 200 yards north, visibility between sites blocked by the forest. No one was visible in any direction. They searched for tracks. Bex was the more experienced outdoors person of the two, and she went around the perimeter of the tent looking at the ground. The ground was soft from recent rain, the kind of Pacific Northwest damp that holds impressions well. She found nothing. No boot prints approaching the tent from any direction. No marks in the soft ground that were consistent with a person carrying a tent to this location and setting it up. She stood up and she looked at Alina and she said, "There are no tracks." Alina said, "Someone set it up." Beck said, "I know." They reported it to the campground host, a retired man named George who drove a small cart between the sites in the mornings. George came and looked at the tent and looked at the ground around it and looked at the campsite, and he did not say much. He took the tent down himself, efficiently, and he rolled it and he put it in the cart, and he said he would check the lost and found for a matching bag. Elena asked him if this had happened before. George was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "In this site, yes." Elena asked how many times. George said, "A few." Elena asked what his explanation was. George said he had worked the campground for 7 years and he did not have an explanation. He said the tent was always the same type, always dark green, always empty, always set up correctly, always in the same corner under the same Douglas fir. Elena asked if the tent was always the same tent. George said he didn't know. He said he had never thought to mark one to find out. He drove away in his cart. Elena and Beck stood in the campsite and looked at the corner under the Douglas fir where the tent had been. The stakes had left small holes in the soft ground that had shown no footprints approaching from any direction. They stayed the second night. This is worth saying because it was a choice, and they were aware of it as a choice. They had discussed it, and they had decided that they had come for 2 nights, and they were going to have 2 nights, and they were not going to let an empty tent that had no explanation drive them home. Nothing happened the second night. In the morning, the corner under the Douglas fir was empty. But the stakes holes from the first tent were still there. And beside them, in the soft ground that had shown no footprints the previous morning, there were new holes. The same pattern, the same spacing, the same tent footprint. Set up, taken down, without tracks, without sound, without any evidence of the person who had done it except the holes in the ground and the shape of absence where a tent had been. Elena has not been back to the Gifford Pinchot. She thinks about the tent sometimes, about the 7 years of identical incidents that George, the campground host, described, about the tent that is always dark green and always empty and always set up in the same corner and has never been explained. She thinks about the second night, about choosing to stay and about nothing happening. About whether nothing happening was reassurance or whether it was simply patience. She does not know which. She does not think she wants to know. Story 4, The Voice from Camp. Daniel Boone National Forest, Kentucky. The rule that every experienced camper and every wilderness safety course and every ranger station handout agrees on is this: if you become separated from your group in the backcountry, stay where you are. Do not move. Do not follow sounds. Do not walk toward voices you think are your group unless you are certain. Stay where you are and signal. Use a whistle. Use a light. Make yourself findable rather than making yourself lost while looking for the people who are already looking for you. Owen Reardon knew this rule. He was 36, and he had been camping since his father took him at age 8, and he had hiked the Red River Gorge section of the Daniel Boone National Forest in eastern Kentucky 4 times over the past decade. He knew the terrain. He was experienced and prepared, and he had the right gear and the right mindset, and he knew the rule. He broke it anyway, because the voice sounded exactly like his brother. There were 4 of them: Owen and his brother David and 2 friends, Marcus and Pete, all in their mid-30s. All experienced hikers, on a 3-day backcountry trip in the Red River Gorge. They had done variations of this trip twice before and had the easy competence of a group that had worked out their systems and knew each other's pace and had no significant source of friction. Good group. Good gear. Good weather for October in Kentucky, cool and clear, the hardwoods in full color, the kind of conditions that make the Red River Gorge one of the most beautiful places in the eastern United States. On the second day, they split briefly on the trail. Not a planned split. Owen had stopped to photograph something, a rock formation, and the others had continued ahead assuming he would catch up, which was a reasonable assumption because he always caught up, and they were on a clearly marked trail with no junctions for the next 2 miles. Owen photographed the formation, and he started walking, and after 20 minutes he had not caught them. He walked faster. He walked for another 15 minutes and he still had not caught them, and the trail had remained straight and unjunctioned, and he should have caught them because they were not faster hikers than him, and he had been moving at a good pace. He stopped. He cupped his hands and he called David's name. His voice went into the forest, and the forest absorbed it and nothing came back. He called again. From somewhere to his left, off the trail in the forest, his brother's voice said his name. Owen, clear and direct. David's specific voice, the voice Owen had been hearing his entire life, with the particular way David said Owen's name, the slight emphasis on the first syllable that was David's alone. Owen turned toward the sound. It had come from the left of the trail, in the forest, not from the trail ahead where David should have been. This was wrong. David should not have been in the forest to the left of the trail. David should have been ahead on the trail. Owen called David's name again. David's voice said his name again, from the same direction, same distance. The forest to the left of the trail, approximately 40 yards in. Owen stood on the trail and he thought about the rule. He thought about it specifically and directly because he knew the rule, and the rule existed for reasons, and those reasons were good ones. He thought about staying on the trail. Then David's voice said, "I'm over here, come look at this." The specific phrasing, "come look at this," it was a sentence David used regularly. It was a sentence Owen had heard David use on every camping trip they had been on together, the particular verbal habit of someone who noticed things and wanted to share them. Come look at this. Rocks, birds, fungi, views. David was always finding something worth looking at and always using that phrasing to invite others to find it with him. Owen stepped off the trail. He went into the forest to the left, 40 yards in the direction of the voice. He pushed through the October undergrowth and he went 40 yards and he found nothing. He looked around, trees, undergrowth, a small rocky outcropping that would have been unremarkable. No David. He called out David's name 3 times. Silence. Then from further in, from a direction that he estimated to be another 30 yards deeper into the forest, David's voice said his name. Owen stopped. He stood in the forest 40 yards from the trail, and he looked in the direction of the voice, and he thought about something. He thought about the Red River Gorge specifically, and about the quality of sound in a sandstone gorge system, the way the rock formations bounced and redirected sound in ways that could make a voice seem to come from a direction it was not coming from. He thought about this acoustic property, which he knew about from 4 trips to this specific geography. And he thought about the fact that no acoustic property explained why David's voice would be in the forest to the left of the trail when David was on the trail ahead of him. He went back to the trail. He walked forward on the trail at a fast pace, and within 8 minutes he found the group, all 3 of them, sitting on a log at a bend in the trail waiting for him. David was there. David asked him what had taken so long. Owen asked David if he had called his name. David said no. He said they had been waiting at the log for 20 minutes, and he had not called out because he knew Owen would catch up, and he had not wanted to confuse the acoustics. Owen said, "You didn't say come look at this." David said, "No." Owen looked at the forest to the left of where they were sitting, which was the direction he had come from, and he thought about the voice, and about the phrasing, and about the 40 yards off the trail, and about the second voice from 30 yards deeper in, and about the rule. He told the others what had happened. Marcus and Pete had no explanation. David had the specific expression of someone hearing something about themselves that is disturbing in a way that does not have a framework. They were all quiet for a moment. Then Pete, who was the most practically oriented of the 4, said, "You went into the forest." Owen said, "I know." Pete said, "You broke the rule." Owen said, "I know." Pete said, "How far in did you go before you stopped?" Owen said 40 yards. Pete said, and then there was a second voice, from 30 yards further. Owen said yes. Pete said, "And if you had followed that one?" He did not finish the sentence. He did not need to finish it because everyone sitting on the log at the bend in the trail understood the geometry of it. Each voice pulling the listener a fixed distance further into the forest. The listener following each one and arriving at nothing and hearing the next one from a fixed distance further in. The sequence continuing until the listener was so far from the trail that finding the trail again was no longer straightforward. Until the listener was lost. They made camp early that night. They built a large fire. They did not discuss what Owen had heard in any sustained way, because discussing it would require them to name what they thought was making the sounds, and naming it required accepting a framework that none of them were entirely ready to accept around a campfire in the Daniel Boone National Forest on a clear October night. What they all accepted, without naming it, was the practical conclusion. The rule existed for a reason. The rule was not about getting lost. The rule was about what it knew you would do if it sounded like someone you loved calling your name from the trees. Owen has been back to the Red River Gorge once since that trip. He stayed on the trail. He did not look at the forest to the left, no matter what he heard coming from it. He kept moving. He did not stop until he reached camp.